Good afternoon. My name is Clay Broughton. Today I'm giving an informative speech on the Eastern Front in World War II. My purpose today is to let you, the audience, know that primarily because of German command failures, the Eastern Front essentially degenerated into a war of numbers and attrition. I think it's interesting to note right off the bat that, at least in America, our history books tend to concentrate more so on battles like Normandy and Pearl Harbor. And while these battles were significant, really the extent of most of the force of the Axis power was on the Eastern Front and was defeated on the Eastern Front by the Russians. And so I think our history books kind of neglect that. I'm going to try to clear that up somewhat this afternoon. First of all, for the reasons that the Eastern Front ultimately developed the way that it did, I think that we need to note the German High Command tended to underestimate the Russians for a couple of reasons. The Russians were unprepared due to a pretty significant purge of the officer corps in the late 1930s by Stalin. They lacked a lot of leadership. This certainly gave the Germans an advantage, but I think the Germans underestimated the Russians' ability to really move and fight on a tactical level, at the very least, in their native land, and also they tended to underestimate the Russians' abilities because they knew that the Russians had no maps. Well, no one had maps of Russia at that time. It was largely unknown, and that tended to benefit the Russians actually more than the Germans because it was their native land. They knew it kind of by default, having lived there. I think another reason why the Germans underestimated the Russians, they didn't understand what their policies would do to the Russian people. And by that I primarily mean the brutalization of the indigenous peoples of Russia by the German SS, which murdered and pillaged quite a bit of the Russian countryside and alienated what otherwise would have been probably a number of allies, particularly in the Ukraine, where many people were tired of Stalin and probably would have greeted the Germans as liberators had they not been treated so brutally. Another reason why the Eastern Front degenerated into essentially a war of attrition was the main fact that the further an invader enters Russia, the more difficult it is to defeat her and the easier it is to defend her. This is kind of shown to us in the history of the war because of the size of Russia, really. When European power enters Russia, its lines continually expand and the density of those lines becomes less and less. And that's what was happening to the Germans. At the same time, the Russians were able to trade space for time. They could stall and simply retreat, and this gave them time to stabilize their military industry, which would allow them to start producing the goods they needed to defeat Germany. At the same time, the Germans were wearing out their men and their tanks, their equipment. It takes a lot out of equipment and men to constantly be on the push, to constantly invade a foreign country, and that's exactly what was happening to the Wehrmacht in general. Mass production was an advantage of the Russians as well, and not of the Germans. The Russians tended to build one or two very, very solid examples of equipment, be it a rifle, hand grenade, tank, airplane, and tended to mass produce just those items. This gave them the advantage of being able to cannibalize a battlefield later, not have to worry about finding part X for vehicle Y. Everything was pretty much the same. You could cannibalize and really recoup your losses that way. The Germans did not have that advantage. And of course, when anyone enters Russia, the weather is a factor. Winter was a very significant force in stopping the Germans in the winter, particularly of 1941-42. Another element why the front degenerated into this situation of attrition that it did was the meddling of German High Command and Adolf Hitler. Directive 33 dictated that invading infantry troops had to be supported by the armor. This was contrary to what many German panzer commanders had wanted to see happen. They wanted the armor to push forward and keep the Russians on their heels. But because of Directive 33 issued by Hitler, the armor had to punch through and then rotate back to help assist the infantry clean up any remaining Russian units. This stopped their momentum tremendously. Directive 34 was another piece of meddling by Hitler, which took units away from the main thrust at Moscow, the head of the Soviet state, and diverted them south to the oil fields of the Caucasus and the agricultural centers of the Ukraine. This slowed down the main advance significantly as well. Another inane order that Hitler had was essentially an order to never give up ground no matter what the tactical situation. This certainly is a very, very glaring example of kind of micromanaging the war and definitely slowed down the Germans. Another reason that meddling hurt was war industries and the way they were run. Hitler did not allow women to work in the war industries where the Russians encouraged it. Because of that, they were able to mass produce a number of things, including weapon systems that at that time in Germany were being designed primarily as offensive when they needed defensive weapon systems by 1943 to hold back the Russians who were starting to make advances. By 1943, the tide had turned. The Germans had lost all strategic initiative. The Russians had launched an offensive in 1944, and this really was going to work in the Russians' favor. Again, the standardization of their tank, air, and artillery power really helped them to advance quickly. And of course, the Allies opening a second front in Normandy took a lot of pressure off the Russians. We go back now and discuss line density. It's the exact opposite now. The Russians' lines are continually becoming more and more dense, and they're able to invade Europe very easily at this point. In conclusion, it's important to note that Germany was the supreme military power on the face of the earth in 1941. That quickly evaporated. Size, terrain, geography, weather all played a factor, but no more than the arrogance of the German high command and their inability to cope with certain situations. Germany probably still could have forced a stalemate by 1943, but by the time of the Normandy invasion in 1944, it was essentially over for the Germans. The war had degenerated. Again, I like to use that term because it really describes the German high command and the situation that was occurring into just a war of attrition. And as history will show and will continue to show, I'm sure, it's very hard to defeat Russia in that type of war.